Bright Tuty. Every student matters.
Now let us turn our focus to the administrative setup under the company. So until now what we learned was the evolution of how the administration came into being. All the laws, all the acts that were passed, all the regulating acts, the charter acts that we just went through, that gave us an idea as to how slowly and gradually improvements were done to rule or to rule India and to control India in a better manner. Okay, they faced certain problems, but in the next act, in the next charter act, in the next regulating act, they try to improve it, and they try to include a better administrative system. Now we look at some of the main components, some of the main factors, some of the main elements, or some of the main components, some of the main parts of that administrative system. So there were four main parts in that administrative system. Okay, the East India Company's administrative system. So they were: number one, the civil service. Okay, number two, the army. Number three, the police. Number four, the judiciary. So the civil service was for the general administration, the overall administration. The army was to protect the territories, and the police was to maintain peace and order, and the judiciary was for providing justice to the people. Okay, now after this we'll look at each of this part. So starting from the civil service, we'll go one by one and try to understand each of the part of the administration. Okay, so first one, we'll look at the civil service or the civil administration. Now Lord Cornwallis was behind the formation of the civil service to administer British territories in India. So Lord Cornwallis played an important role in the formation of the civil service. Okay, he made strict regulations to ban private trade by the company's officials and made the directors pay a good amount of salaries to them. Many men were attracted to that wonderful offer. Therefore, Fort William College was set up in Calcutta for the training purpose. This is how the civil service, Indian civil service, came into being. So Lord Cornwallis, as he set up the civil service, he made sure that the officials of the East India Company would not take part in any private trading activities. Okay, why did the individual official, British official, take part in private trading activities? Because they did not receive good salaries. They were not paid well by the board of directors or by the British government. Okay, so Lord Cornwallis said that the British officials or the East India Company officials need to be paid very good salaries so that they do not go and take part in the trading activities and chase behind all those activities to make more profit and more money for themselves. Okay, and in order to make these British officials civil servants, a college was set up for their training, for their learning, for their education, and that college was called Fort William College. Okay, this Fort William is still present in Kolkata. Okay. So Fort William College was set up in Calcutta for the training, learning and other purposes, education purposes of the civil servants. Okay. And a similar similar kind of college was also set up in England for the training of the officers, okay, civil servants. At the beginning, the civil servants were chosen by the directors of the East India Company, but after 1853 they were selected through a competitive exam. So if they passed that exam, they would be selected, but before 1853 they would be picked by the directors of the East India Company. Okay. Now, in the civil service, no Indians were included. They were excluded from the service. Okay, all posts were given to the Englishmen, to the British people. Okay, Lord Cornwallis and the Governor General who used to follow him never trusted Indians. So Indians were never trusted. Okay, they were not considered good enough, as good as the British officers. They were considered incapable, and they were also considered inferior. Okay, they were considered not good enough for taking up the responsibility, for taking up the position. Okay, and the examinations were held only in England. So obviously the Indians could not pay a lot of money to travel all the way from India to England and sit for the exams. So Indians in no way could sit for the exams or become a civil servant in the beginning. Okay. Another thing that we have to understand is that British India was divided into districts. Okay. Now, each district had three main departments or three main officials who looked at the proper functioning of that district. Say, for example, imagine that how each state in India today each state have many districts, right? Now, each district during the time of the East India Company were run by three main officers. Now, who were these officers? The first one was the collector, the second the magistrate, and the third the judge. Now, collector supervised the collection of revenues. It collected revenues from the people, and it also ran the administration of the district. It looked after the overall administration of the district. The magistrate looked after the law and order in the district. Okay, made sure that proper law and order was maintained. And the judge administered justice. The judge provided justice when somebody requested for the same. Okay. Now the next part or the component that we are going to look at is the army or the colonial army. Okay. Now the English required, or the East India Company required, a strong army to conquer and control India. They needed very strong army to maintain control over India. Army was made mainly to push colonial interest. So the army was formed, the army was set up, soldiers were recruited only so that these were put to work towards for the benefit of the company or for the benefit of the British. Okay. It played three major roles in the expansion of the British Empire. Okay. It played important role in the expansion of the British Empire as the East India Company expanded its control and territory. The army played important role in that expansion. The army mainly had Indians as soldiers and English as officers. So the Indians would be made the soldiers, okay, the foot soldiers, and the officers would not be the Indian ones, but only the English ones, the British ones, okay. The Indian soldiers were paid very less wages. There were three Indian companies that drew a salary of 300 rupees per month. The highest position that the Indian could get at that time was that of a Subedar. So that was the highest that they could get. Okay. The Indian soldiers were called sepoys. The soldiers were loyal to the British masters. This was because they were paid more salaries than what the Indian rulers in India paid their soldiers. That is why all the soldiers were recruited. They were interested to work under the British. Okay. Now, the British never gave Indian soldiers true justice. Now, these Indian soldiers, even when they were paid proper salaries by the British or the East India Company, they were not treated well, okay? They were removed from responsible positions quite easily. They were at the mercy of the East India Company officials. They were removed when the officers wanted them to be removed. So this was one discrimination the Indians did not like. They were discriminated. They were not treated equally to the English soldiers, to the English officers, right? They were discriminated. The Indian soldiers were discriminated. And because of this, the Indians had developed anger and hatred towards the East India Company. And this anger and hatred became one of the reasons for them to take part in the revolt of 1857. Okay, the discrimination that they faced, the unequal treatment that they faced as soldiers under the British government or under the East India Company was one of the main reasons which drove them towards the revolt of 1857. You'll understand more about it when we deal with the revolt of 1857. Alright. Now next part of the administration is the police. Now earlier the police were the police duties, or basically the zamindars of the villages. The zamindars acted as police. Okay, the duties of police were fulfilled by the zamindars. Okay, but later on, Lord Cornwallis created a permanent police system in India. Okay, now each district had thanas and darogas. District superintendent was the chief of the district police. Okay, the police succeeded in removing many social evils such as dacoit, theft, thugs, etc. The police also helped in the suppression of growth of nationalism. When the Indians were rising against the British government for freedom of India, the police played a huge role in making sure that these Indians were arrested, their voices were put down. Okay. The discrimination was practiced even in police. So just like the armies, how they faced discrimination, in the police department also the Indians faced discrimination. The Indians never received higher posts in the police department. It was only the English who received the higher post. Okay, and the people were treated very badly by the police officers. Okay, the people feared the police. The police did not help the people. Okay, and the police accepted bribes and harassed the people. So because of this, the people in India were not so happy with the police as well. Now the last component is the judicial service. Okay, the department which provided justice. Okay, before the coming of English, the Indians would follow laws based on local traditions and customs. So before the East India Company's administration was set up, the Indians followed their own old traditions, their customs to deal with cases of justice, cases of crimes. Okay. In case of Hindus, the Shastras. So the Hindus followed Shastras, okay, and the English did not interfere with the existing system. They did not interfere with how they dealt with crime and justice, okay. Lord Warren Hastings, he made criminal and civil court in each district. Now in each district, criminal and civil court were set up. The courts were governed by the company's collector. So the district collector was the head of the court. Okay. The criminal courts were given to the natives. The Indians were given to the criminal court, and the civil court was for the English, okay, or the British. There were two courts of appeal which were also set up, and they were called Sardar Diwani Adalat and Sardar Nizamat Adalat. Okay, these were set up under the Regulating Act of 1773. And under this act, Supreme Court was also established in Kolkata or Calcutta, present-day Kolkata, and Lord Impey was the Chief Justice of the court. Okay, by the Act of 1871, it was decided that the English law shall be applied only cases of English. The Indians shall be tried under their own legal system. So after 1773, there was another act which was introduced, and this act said that the English people would be tried. The English, when they go to the court, then the English laws would be applied to them. But for the Indians, their own legal system would be applied to provide them justice or to provide punishment in case of in case of crime they have committed. Okay. In 1793, there was a compilation of the famous Cornwallis Code, and this was brought out to guide the officers of the new judicial service. So the new set of officers, the judges, the chief justice, they all had to be provided some guide so that they could function in a proper manner. So they all referred to this Cornwallis Code in order to function, okay, in order to provide justice and in order to also punish if crimes were committed. In 1833, the codification of Indian system of law was done. So in 1833, the Indian system of law was also codified. Codified meaning the system of law that was brought out, that became the law which had to be followed by everyone. Okay, that could not be challenged. All right, that became the ultimate law. This made the Indian secure, as justice was not as per the whims and fancies of the judging authority, but according to the law. Now, when this Indian system of law was codified, the Indians were happy because now the judges, the chief justice, and everybody had to follow the law that was codified, that was written. Okay, so the law would be same for everyone. So that was good, right? So because of that, the Indians were quite happy. Now, this codification of law is also called the rule of law. Now, the rule of law, what it means is that everyone is equal before the law. So, even if you are British, even if you are Indian, does not matter. The rule will be same for both the British and the Indian, and the law would be equal. Okay, the law would be same, and everyone would be treated irrespective of the color, the race, the religion, irrespective of the language people speak, they would be treated equally. So this is what the rule of law meant. Okay. Now let us look at the rule of law briefly. Now, rule of law made everyone equal in the eyes of law. So when we say rule of law, that means equality. Equality is what comes to our head, right? It means that everyone is equal before the law. Be it the king, be it the servant, both will be same before the eyes of the law. Okay? The distinctions that were initially practiced amongst Hindus, Muslims, the Brahmins, non-Brahmins, these were stopped. So earlier, Hindus, Muslims were treated differently because they were Hindus and Muslims, Brahmins, non-Brahmins, Christians, Buddhists. All these distinctions came to be stopped, okay, because now everyone was equal before the law. The rule of law stated that a criminal is a criminal in the eyes of law, and no matter what caste, creed or religion he belongs to. But the critics found out defects even in this system. So like I said, the rule of law said that if you have committed a crime, then you will be a criminal. Okay, so it doesn't matter if you are Hindu, if you are high caste Hindu, if you are lower caste Hindu, if you have committed the crime, you will be punished for the crime that you have committed. Okay, and the law will be same and it will be applied in a same manner even if you are from different caste, creed, religion, etc. It doesn't matter. So this was the basic principle, this was the basic meaning of the rule of law. But despite the codification of the Indian law, despite the rule of law, there were many defects in this system. So let us look at it. Okay. Number one is that the Europeans had set up separate courts for themselves. Like we already saw, the courts where people went to get justice, where people went to seek some justice. These courts were different. The courts were different for the Europeans and the courts were different for the Indians. So where you do not see if both the Europeans and the Indians were treated equally, then there would be no such separation of the courts, right? So the separation of the courts itself shows that how people were treated differently, right? So the rule of law does not apply. The second problem is that European criminal could not be tried by an Indian judge. Now, if there was a European officer or European person who has committed a crime, now the Indian judge could not try that person. Indian judge could not decide for that person. Who could only decide? A European judge. Okay, so this was the case. Had there been equality, then no matter whether you're European or non-European, anyone can take that case. Any judge can take that case, right? But no, the European would take the European subjects, the Indians would take the Indian subjects. So this was the case, all right. The third drawback. Many a times the European criminal was set free even from the murder charge by paying a certain amount of money as fine. So many times the European subjects, the European people who were arrested for a crime, who were punished and put to jail, but they were forgiven on payment of certain amount of fine, they were made to go free. So this was a very unfair means that was practiced by the British government or the East India Company. Okay. So the written code of laws was there, but there was no equality that prevailed. So the laws were there. It said rule of law. It said everyone is equal in the eyes of the law. But then equality did not exist. Equality was not there between the Europeans and the Indians, right? Moreover, the whole judicial system was very expensive. This whole system of going to the court, of hiring a lawyer, this was a very expensive affair, and only rich people could afford the lawyers, and the poor remained helpless because they cannot afford to pay the lawyers, they cannot afford to get justice, alright? So these were the problems of the rule of law. Okay. Now let us look at the main features, the key features of the administrative setup or the administration of the East India Company. Okay. The first is that the Indians were denied share in the country's administration, meaning the Indians were not allowed to take part in the administrative setup of the East India Company. It was only the Europeans who were selected, who were recruited as officers, who were given posts, but the Indians were not given any role in the administrative setup. Okay. The second key feature. The Indians were not considered suitable, they were considered incapable, hence no important posts were given to them in any sphere of administration such as police, army, etc. Okay. Why they were not given any posts is because Indians were considered incapable, Indians were considered to be not good enough to hold positions such as that of a police officer or an army soldier or a soldier, okay, or an army officer, sorry. The third key feature is that the British plundered the wealth of the country as India was the only colony, not the country. So, as this administrative setup was established, the British administration was set up, but the British officials, the East India Company, they plundered the wealth of the country and drove India to poverty. Okay. The fourth feature is that the East India Company established the rule of law, okay, which said that everyone was equal in front of the eyes of the law. But they never practiced equality in reality. The Indians were considered inferior to the Europeans. Okay, the Indians were not as good enough as the Europeans. That is what they practiced. Okay. The fifth and the last feature is that as the laws were codified, so the judging authority had to decide according to the written laws. Now the laws were codified, okay, they were written, they were to be followed, they would not be omitted, they would not be rubbed, okay, they would not be removed. So all the judges, everybody had to follow that rule. Now, if that law did not benefit or if that law harmed the Indians, okay, harmed the interest of the Indians or the well-being of the Indians, still those laws were followed. So these laws, although it was brought out for the proper administration, but um, it failed to focus on the benefit of the Indians. It drove the Indians to poverty. It drove the Indians to misery. Okay, so with that we have come to the end of this chapter.